October 10, 1944. Near Vionville, France. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, stood before the assembled men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the cold French mud, clinging to his boots, as he surveyed the rows of M4 Sherman tanks and their segregated crews. The Third Army was advancing, and Patton needed any armor to maintain momentum. He addressed them with his infamous pragmatic brutality. "I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches," he declared, his voice cutting through the damp air. For the men of the 761st, this was the moment they had trained 2 years for. For General Patton, it was a tactical necessity. For the history books, it was the beginning of 183 consecutive days in combat. What General Patton didn't know, what the army establishment that had delayed the 761st's deployment for months couldn't have imagined, was that he was unleashing a force that would shatter every racist assumption about African American combat effectiveness. Over the next 7 months, from November 1944 to May 1945, this single battalion would transform from a political problem into one of the Wehrmacht's most significant tactical nightmares. The Wehrmacht's most significant tactical nightmares, the mathematics of their campaign were brutal and undeniable. The 761st would be credited with inflicting over 130,000 casualties on the enemy, capturing or destroying 34 enemy tanks, and helping to breach the formidable Siegfried Line. This achievement would cost them 71 of their own Sherman tanks, but their psychological impact far outweighed the numbers. One captured German officer, a report later noted, asked in apparent disbelief, "How many Negro Panzer divisions are there?" He could not comprehend that this level of relentless pressure came from a single battalion. This story is about the 761st Black Panthers, the extraordinary heroism of men like Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, and their impact on the battlefield and the integration of the United States military. But this battalion was never intended to see combat at all. Its existence was a paradox, born from political necessity and military segregation 2 years earlier, at a place called Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The activation of the 761st Tank Battalion on April 1, 1942, was not a response to a battlefield crisis. It was a concession to a domestic one. As the United States mobilized for total war, the Roosevelt administration faced immense pressure from African American leaders and newspapers demanding the right to fight the Double V campaign for victory against fascism abroad and victory against segregation at home. The War Department, deeply skeptical and mired in prevailing racist ideology, reluctantly authorized the formation of segregated combat units. This was an experiment the Army establishment did not want to succeed. The institutional assumption was that African American soldiers were unfit for the complexity, stress, and initiative required by combat arms, particularly armored warfare. They were deemed suitable for labor battalions or logistical support, not for commanding 70,000-pound vehicles under direct fire, particularly armored warfare. They were deemed suitable for labor battalions or logistical support, not for commanding 70,000-pound vehicles under direct fire. The 761st was formed at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, and later moved to Camp Hood, Texas. They were subjected to a grueling training regimen that systematically lasted longer than that of equivalent white units. While white battalions were often activated, trained, and shipped overseas in under a year, the 761st was held in the continental United States for over 2 years, 929 days. This was a deliberate delay. The Army, reluctant to commit the unit, kept them in reserve, mastering gunnery, combined arms tactics, and vehicle maintenance, until they were perhaps the most overtrained, underutilized battalion in the entire U.S. Army. The skepticism was pervasive, running from the War Department down to field commanders like General Patton, who initially shared the establishment's doubts. The men of the 761st understood their position perfectly. They were not just training to fight the Wehrmacht, they were training to disprove the prejudices of their own command. Failure would not be a tactical loss, it would be cited for decades as definitive proof of racial inferiority. The 761st was equipped with the standard workhorse of the U.S. Army, the M4 Sherman tank, primarily the M4A3 75W and later the upgraded M4A3 76W variants. The battalion's full authorized strength was approximately 712 personnel. Its command structure was a stark illustration of military segregation. 676 African American enlisted men were led by a mixed officer corps of 30 black officers and 6 white senior officers. Their M4A3s were powered by the reliable 4GAA Vate engine, capable of a maximum speed of 26 miles per hour. The Sherman's armor, 2.5 inches thick on the upper front hull and sloped at 47 degrees, was adequate in 1942 but dangerously thin by 1944. Dangerously thin by 1944. Its 75mm M3 gun was a versatile, effective weapon against infantry and fortifications. But it was not a dedicated tank killer. When the 761st entered combat, they faced the Wehrmacht's Panther. The comparison was unfavorable. The Panther Ausfalls OG featured frontal armor ranging from 3.9 to 4.3 inches, rendering it effectively immune to the Sherman's 75mm gun at standard combat ranges. Furthermore, the Panther's high-velocity 75mm Keiko K42 L70 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal plate from over a mile away. The M4 Sherman's advantages were not in one-on-one duels. They were in mechanical reliability, numerical availability, and the maneuverability its 26 mm speed afforded. But the 761st's greatest disadvantage, in the eyes of their own army, was the color of their skin. This created the central irony of their deployment. As one post-war report summarized, the irony, Nazi racial ideology predicted African American soldiers would be militarily inferior, yet Wehrmacht tactical reports show no awareness they were fighting segregated black units. German intelligence saw inferior machines, the M4 Sherman, but their tactical reports simply noted the arrival of a new, aggressive and relentless American armored unit. They were not fighting black tankers, they were fighting American tankers who refused to break. By the time Patton stood before them on that damp October morning, the 761st was not an experiment. It was a finely honed weapon, 2 years in the making, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. The 929 days of waiting were over. Within 3 weeks of General Patton's speech, the 761st Tank Battalion was attached to the 26th Infantry Division and committed to the 3rd Army's grueling, muddy offensive across the Saar Valley. The skepticism of the American High Command was now irrelevant. The battalion's immediate objective was the town of Morville-les-Vic, a small, stone-built village that had already repulsed one assault by the 26th Infantry, its defenders deeply entrenched. November 7, 1944. Morville-les-Vic, France. The rain was incessant, turning the fields into a quagmire that threatened to swallow the M4 Shermans. Company B of the 761st led the attack. Almost immediately, the American infantry support was pinned down by a heavy, accurate German mortar barrage, forcing the tankers to advance alone. This was the moment of truth, the scenario every tanker feared: armor without infantry, vulnerable to every anti-tank gun, machine gun nest, and Panzerfaust. The Shermans did not stop. They pushed into the narrow streets, maneuvering under intense fire, using their 75mm main guns as assault artillery. They systematically fired high-explosive rounds directly into houses, stone walls, and fortified cellars, silencing the machine guns one by one. The fighting was intimate and brutal. A concealed anti-tank gun destroyed one Sherman. Private Clifford Adams, standing exposed in his tank's turret, was killed by machine gun fire, becoming the battalion's first casualty. But the line held, and the assault continued. By nightfall, after hours of relentless, unsupported armored combat, Morville-les-Vic was captured. The 761st had taken its first objective. The tactical result was clear. The psychological result was clear. The psychological result was chaos. As the tankers of Company B began processing the surviving German defenders, they were met not with the weary respect of defeated soldiers, but with genuine terror. These Wehrmacht troops had been saturated with years of Nazi racial propaganda. They had been told African Americans were subhuman savages, and they fully expected to be massacred without mercy. This propaganda fueled fear, rather than the tactical reality of the battle, dominated their reaction. This terror led to desperate, bizarre acts. As one after-action report documented, one of the Germans refused to surrender to black troops, drew a straight razor and took his own life. He chose suicide over capture. What German intelligence failed to recognize, however, was the profound disconnect between their racist ideology and the battlefield reality. The most critical signal was the one that was missing. German tactical reports from the front showed no awareness that they were fighting a segregated unit. They did not see black soldiers, they saw American soldiers. Their analysis focused entirely on the familiar profile of the M4 Sherman and the unexpected, relentless aggression of its crews. This cognitive dissonance was captured perfectly by another German prisoner. After witnessing the 761st advance alone, he stated he had not come up against such bravery since he had been at the Eastern Front. This was the highest possible compliment from a German soldier, an admission that contradicted every propaganda briefing he had ever received. The Wehrmacht High Command remained oblivious. They registered the fall of Morville-les-Vic as another local defeat, caused by aggressive American tankers. They failed to identify the 761st as a distinct entity, and thus failed to analyze the unique motivation of a unit fighting a two-front war. This intelligence failure meant they were unprepared for the 182 days of combat that were to follow. The German tactical reports from Morville-les-Vic focused on the M4 Sherman, failing to identify the unique composition of the 761st. This intelligence failure would be rendered catastrophic not by a machine but by the will of one man. In an event that defied every military and medical regulation, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, 26, from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. He was one of 11 children of Cherokee and African American descent who had worked on the railroads before enlisting in January 1942. After 2.5 years of relentless training, he was a seasoned, respected non-commissioned officer in Company A. On November 16, 1944, he would redefine the limits of human endurance. At approximately 1400 hours on November 16th, near Gebling, France, Company A was probing the German defences. The advance was slow, hampered by sucking mud and concealed anti-tank positions. The explosion was instantaneous, a deafening upward concussion that lifted the 30-ton M4 Sherman, a German Tellermine. Inside the turret, the crew was slammed against the steel bulkheads. Lived 30, the 30-ton M4 Sherman, a German Tellermine. Inside the turret, the crew was slammed against the steel bulkheads. Staff Sergeant Rivers felt a blinding, white-hot impact, a sensation less of cutting and more of complete separation. He looked down. His right leg, from the knee to the ankle, was laid open. The muscle was slashed to the bone. Blood, shockingly dark, pulsed from the wound, already pooling on the turret floor. The tank was disabled. The crew evacuated the crippled Sherman under fire. A medic reached Rivers, took one look at the grotesque wound, and prepared a sret of morphine. Rivers, his face pale but rigid, waved him off. Liver you say klafsi noftis tonsadin shawet wast. The crew evacuated the crippled Sherman under fire. A medic reached Rivers, took one look at the grotesque wound, and prepared a sret of morphine. Rivers, his face pale but rigid, waved him off. The medic insisted. Morphine was the first step toward evacuation. Evacuation meant a trip to the rear, a field hospital, and eventually a ticket home. It was $1 million wound, a non-fatal, non-superficial injury that guaranteed repatriation. Rivers refused it. He refused the morphine. He refused the evacuation. As the day's fighting subsided, his company commander, Captain David J. Williams, found him. Williams was blunt. "Ruben, you are going away. You have $1 million wound." Rivers, weakened from blood loss but his voice unwavering, looked at his captain. "This is one order," Rivers stated. "The only order I'll ever disobey." He would not leave his men. That night, as his crewmates rested, Rivers lay in the cold, his leg wrapped in a sodden field dressing, the wound already beginning to swell, the first insidious signs of gangrene setting in. He refused all painkillers, Fearing they would dull his senses, at 0800 hours on November 17th, Ruben Rivers, unable to walk unassisted, was lifted into the turret of a new M4 Sherman. He took command. For the next 2 days, he continued to lead his platoon, his legs stiffening, the pain becoming a constant throbbing fire. The gangrene was advancing, his crew could smell the putrefaction, the infection was poisoning his blood. He was feverish, but he refused to stop directing his gunner, engaging targets, and pushing the advance. The climax came at 0600 on November 19th. Company A was ordered to lead the assault on Bourgaltroff. Rivers's tank led the way. They immediately ran into a wall of pre-sighted German anti-tank fire. The entire company was pinned down, vulnerable, unable to advance or retreat. From his turret, his vision blurring from pain and fever, Rivers saw what the others couldn't, the camouflaged muzzle flashes of the German IT guns. He grabbed his radio, his voice cutting through the static. "I see 'em," he transmitted to Captain Williams. "We'll fight 'em." It was a suicide mission. To expose the German guns, Rivers had to draw their fire. He ordered his driver forward, maneuvering his Sherman to cover the rest of the company as they began to withdraw. He and his gunner fired continuously, making their tank the single most visible, most dangerous target on the field. Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr. was watching from his own tank, about 25 meters away. "I was about 25 meters from him," Dade recalled. The first German round struck the tank, rocking it. The second was precise. The next shot came right through the turret, just took his head off. The projectile, likely an 88mm shell, decapitated Rivers instantly. His actions, however, had saved the rest of the company. They regrouped and, galvanized by his sacrifice, overran the German position. Staff Sergeant Rivers' fighting spirit and daring leadership were, as his 1997 Medal of Honor citation would state, an inspiration to his unit. But this was not an isolated incident. It was the most extreme example of a pattern of behavior that defined the 761st Tank Battalion. It was a systematic refusal to surrender, to evacuate, or to break. On November 7th, at Morville-les-Vic, Sergeant Roy King's tank was struck by a Panzerfaust, wounding him. Like Rivers, he refused evacuation to stay with his company. He would be killed in action on the same day as Rivers, November 19th. Beginning on November 10th, Sergeant Warren Crissy established a legend. Repeatedly, he would dismount his tank under direct fire to reconnoiter enemy positions on foot. When his tank was disabled, he commandeered a jeep, mounted a .50 caliber machine gun, and attacked German infantry formations alone, earning a battlefield commission to lieutenant for his relentless aggression. The pattern intensified during the Battle of the Bulge. On January 9, 1945, in the frozen hell of Tillet, Belgium, Sergeant Frank Cochrane's tank was hit 3 times in a continuous grinding engagement. The tank remained functional, and Cochrane refused to pull back, continuing the fight. The same day in Tillet, Captain Charles Popgates led a 10-tank assault. His own tank was destroyed. He evacuated the crew, ordered them to another vehicle, and continued to lead the assault on foot, coordinating fire until the objective was taken. Also in Tillet, Lieutenant Moses Dade's Sherman took a direct hit that blew the entire turret clean off the chassis. Also in Tillet, Lieutenant Moses Dade's Sherman took a direct hit that blew the entire turret clean off the chassis. He and his crew survived, climbed back into the smoking turretless hull, and continued to fight, firing the hull's .30 caliber machine gun at German positions. This was not standard doctrine. It was personal. For white soldiers, a $1 million wound was a blessing. For the men of the 761st, evacuation felt like failure. They were fighting not only the Wehrmacht, but the prejudices of their own army. To leave the line was to give credence to the racist assumption that they lacked fitness for combat, that they would break under pressure. They chose, repeatedly, to die rather than be seen as quitting. German field intelligence remained fractured. Their tactical reports obsessed over the aggressive American tankers and the inferiority of the Sherman, but they failed to connect this ferocity to the 761st's segregated status. The recognition came not in high-level analysis, but in the shocked faces of prisoners, During this same period, one captured SS prisoner, a man indoctrinated with the absolute certainty of master race ideology, expressed profound, speechless disbelief at seeing his captors. He could not process the reality of black tankers. The propaganda had insisted this was impossible, yet here they were, the men who had just overrun his position, their uniforms stained with the same mud and blood as his. This ferocity born of a two-front war was the 761st's true secret weapon. It was a force multiplier that German intelligence could not quantify and American command had never anticipated. As the 761st breached the Siegfried Line, this reputation for relentless assault would become their primary tactical asset, a psychological weapon as potent as their 76mm guns. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers' sacrifice at Bourgaltroff was not an isolated act of desperation. It was the documented standard for a pattern of relentless aggression that would systematically break German defensive lines across France, Belgium, and Germany for the next 6 months. Between November 1944 and May 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion transformed from an untested experiment into the 3rd Army's armoured spearhead, demonstrating a ferocious non-stop offensive capability that German commanders found impossible to counter. The battalion's motto, "Come out fighting," became a tactical reality, engagement after engagement, November 7th to 9th, 1944. Morville-les-Vic, France. In their first major engagement, the 761st was ordered to take the heavily defended town that had already repulsed infantry assaults. Advancing without their own infantry support, who were pinned down, the tankers pushed into the streets, using 75mm guns as assault artillery. They systematically reduced strongpoints, house by house. The victory was total, and the manner of the victory, unsupported armoured aggression, shocked the German defenders. November 8, 1944. Vic-sur-Seille, France. Simultaneously, other elements were ordered to clear a critical roadblock covered by anti-tank guns. Rather than wait for engineers, the tankers advanced, deliberately drawing fire to expose the German positions while coordinating their own suppressive barrage. The roadblock was removed, the column advanced. The 761st established its tempo. Problems were not to be analysed, they were to be overwhelmed. November 16th to 19th, 1944. Gebling and Bourgaltroff, France. This was the engagement that cost Ruben Rivers his life. For 3 days the battalion was in continuous, grinding combat against deeply entrenched German positions. Despite heavy casualties, including the loss of Sergeant Roy King, the battalion never broke. They absorbed losses, reorganized under contact, and continued the assault. The capture of both towns proved the battalion's resilience was institutional. January 7th to 9th, 1945. Tillet, Belgium. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division with the objective of taking the frozen, fortified Crossroads town. For 48 hours, in sub-zero temperatures, they engaged in a brutal tank-on-tank slugging match. It was here that Captain Gates led on foot and Lieutenant Dade fought from a turretless tank. The 761st's relentless pressure finally shattered the German defenders, forcing a general withdrawal. March 23, April 2, 1945. The Siegfried Line, Germany. The 761st was one of the first armoured units to breach the most formidable defensive line on the Western Front. German doctrine relied on these concrete and steel positions to halt any armoured assault. The 761st did not halt. They bypassed what they couldn't destroy and annihilated what they couldn't bypass, creating a gap for following units. This was a strategic breakthrough. April 26, May 4, 1945. The Rhine crossing and the Elbe River. The Mo 1945. The Rhine crossing and the Elbe River. After crossing the Rhine, the battalion raced across southern Germany. Organized resistance collapsed. On May 4th, the 761st made contact with the 1st Ukrainian front of the Soviet Army at the Elbe River. In these final days, they also became liberators, uncovering the horrors of the Gunskirchen concentration camp. In 183 consecutive days, they had fought from France to Austria, The 761st did not just endure. When the battalion arrived in France in September 1944, it was equipped with the new M4A3 76W Sherman, mounting the higher-velocity 76mm gun, a critical upgrade for engaging German armor. But their most significant evolution was adaptation born of attrition. Sherman losses were so severe that by January 1945, the battalion was forced to use its M5 Stuart light tanks, vehicles designed for reconnaissance in direct combat. They learned to leverage the Stuart's speed using them as flanking elements. This aggression was recognized by the infantry they supported. One white veteran stated, "I like to fight alongside the black platoons because they laid such a large volume of fire on enemy positions." Their own commander agreed, reporting, "In courage, coolness, dependability and pride, they are on a par with any white troops I have ever had occasion to work with." German command, facing this relentless assault, attempted systematic countermeasures. Each failed. Strategic redeployment. In the Saar, the Wehrmacht deployed the veteran 6th SS Mountain Division Nord directly against the 761st Sector. The rationale: this elite, battle-hardened unit would halt the American advance. The result: the 761st did not halt. They met the 6th SSS head-on and shattered its formations, forcing a withdrawal. Rearguard tactics. As they fell back, German engineers perfected rearguard actions, using extensive minefields and demolition to slow the 761st. The result: this achieved tactical delays, but it was a strategic failure. The 761st's own engineers, often working under direct fire, cleared the obstacles, or the tanks simply bypassed them. Mobile anti-tank defense. The Germans increasingly relied on mobile-line, two-man Panzerfaust teams, ambushing tanks in close-quarters urban combat. The result: this was their most effective tactic, scoring kills like that of Sergeant Roy King. But it was a strategic failure. The 761st responded with overwhelming firepower, machine gunning and blasting every potential ambush point, expending ammunition at a rate that simply vaporized the German teams. The psychological impact on the German soldier was profound, a direct result of their own propaganda. Wehrmacht prisoners were, as one report stated, terrified to be captured by black soldiers, believing they could expect no mercy from such savages. This terror manifested as suicidal refusals to surrender or more commonly as speechless shock. The propaganda had insisted this was impossible. The cognitive dissonance was captured perfectly by a captured German officer, who asked his interrogators in genuine disbelief, "How many Negro Panzer divisions are there?" He could not accept that this relentless 183-day assault was the work of a single battalion. By May 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion had destroyed German tactical formations, shattered elite divisions, and inspired terror in enemy soldiers. But their tactical dominance transformed into a strategic revolution, not on German maps, but within the command structure of the United States Army. The 761st forced the American military establishment to fundamentally restructure its racist, segregationist doctrine. When General Patton stood before them in October 1944, his words, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army," were more than a greeting. They were the admission of a new reality. The previous doctrine, codified in decades of Army policy, held that African American soldiers were intellectually and emotionally unfit for the rigors of sustained armored combat. The 761st's 183 consecutive days on the line was not an experiment, it was a forced, systematic destruction of that doctrine. The new battlefield-proven doctrine was that segregated units, when given equal training and leadership, were not just capable, but relentlessly effective. Patton's utilization of the 761st as a spearhead unit, contradicting the prevailing doubts of his own peers, was a pragmatic decision that had profound strategic consequences. He proved that a significant untapped pool of manpower was not just viable, but essential for victory. This doctrinal shift was validated in the war's most critical campaigns. The 761st was not a peripheral unit, it was committed at decisive points where failure would have had strategic consequences. This doctrinal shift was validated in the war's most critical campaigns. The 761st was not a peripheral unit, it was committed at decisive points where failure would have had strategic consequences. The Battle of the Bulge, specifically the assault on Tillet, Belgium in January 1945, was a definitive test. The context: the German counter-offensive was collapsing, but elite units like the 6th SS Mountain Division held crucial crossroads, stalling the entire Allied counter-thrust. The 761st was ordered to take Tillet, a town for which other units had already bled heavily. The impact: for 48 brutal, frozen hours, the 761st engaged in a relentless assault, finally breaking the 6th SS and capturing the town. Without the 761st's sustained pressure, the German line at Tillet would have held, delaying the 87th Infantry Division and complicating Patton's strategic consolidation of the Bulge. The Siegfried Line breach in March 1945 was even more significant. The context: this was Germany's west wall, a seemingly impenetrable, miles-deep belt of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, and anti-tank positions, designed to be the Third Reich's last stand. The role of the 761st: they were among the very first armoured units to attack it. The impact: the battalion ruptured the line. Their aggressive combined arms tactics proved that the static defences could be overwhelmed by concentrated, mobile firepower. This was not a minor tactical victory. It was a strategic rupture that signalled the end of organised, fortified defence for Germany itself. Their continuous operations through the Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe were not just a series of battles, they were a single 183-day strategic offensive that demonstrated the viability of this new forced doctrine. This strategic impact is confirmed, paradoxically, by the silence of German intelligence. As one analysis concluded, the 761st's greatest German quote may be the silence, the lack of any German military assessment distinguishing them from white units. This was the ultimate validation. German reports saw aggressive American tankers and relentless armoured assaults. Their racist ideology rendered them incapable of seeing who was inside those tanks. The 761st had achieved complete tactical integration on the battlefield. The comment from a German prisoner that he had not come up against such bravery since he had been at the Eastern Front was an admission that German doctrine had no answer for this level of motivation. Yet the American command that benefited from this bravery was slow to acknowledge it. The 761st's strategic contribution was undeniable in May 1945, but official recognition would take 3 decades. The Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor for a combat unit, was finally awarded to the 761st Tank Battalion in 1978. This 33-year delay was not an oversight. It was the last vestige of the very doctrine the 761st had destroyed. The 1978 award was not a retroactive honor, it was the moment the Army's paperwork finally officially admitted a strategic fact that had been proven in blood at Morville-les-Vic, Tillet and the Siegfried Line. Ultimately, the 761st was the human element in a war that had become brutally mathematical. The tactical duels between their Shermans and German Panthers were microcosms of the larger industrial conflict. The production statistics documented the mathematical impossibility of a German victory. Between 1942 and 1945, Germany produced 6,132 Panther tanks. In that same period, the United States produced over 50,000 M4 Shermans. This was an 8.2-to-1 industrial ratio. German tactical skill, even with a superior machine, could not defeat this overwhelming, relentless replacement. The Wehrmacht could destroy a Sherman, but it could not destroy the shipyard or the factory that replaced it in 48 hours. The 761st Tank Battalion was the living proof that this industrial might was matched by human will. They were the men inside the 8.2 fighting with a ferocity born of a two-front war, proving that the courage to come out fighting was as unstoppable as the assembly lines themselves. By May 1945, the industrial mathematics of the M4 Sherman versus the Panther had proven German defeat was inevitable. But the strategic impact of the 761st Tank Battalion was not measured in production ratios. It was measured in 183 consecutive days of blood, steel, and a relentless advance that tore the foundation from American military doctrine. The final numbers of their campaign reveal a scale of sacrifice and effectiveness that statistics alone can scarcely capture. The 761st fought continuously from November 7, 1944 to May 4, 1945, 183 consecutive days in combat. No other unit in the U.S. Army sustained such a continuous operational tempo. This advance cost the battalion 71 M4 Sherman tanks. It cost them approximately 356 personnel killed, wounded, or missing in action, a casualty rate approaching 50% of the unit's total strength. In those 183 days, the 761st was credited with destroying 34 German tanks. They captured or destroyed 113 large-caliber anti-tank guns and artillery pieces. They eliminated 461 wheeled vehicles, most of them supply trucks vital to German logistics. They inflicted an estimated 130,000 casualties on the enemy, a staggering number for a single battalion. The price was paid individually. The unit received approximately 300 Purple Hearts. For their actions, its men were awarded 11 Silver Stars, and after a 52-year delay, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers received the Medal of Honor. When the war ended, the surviving members of the 761st returned not to a hero's welcome, but to a segregated America. The establishment that had been reluctant to send them to war was quick to forget their sacrifice. But the men themselves refused to be forgotten. They formed the 761st Tank Battalion and Allied Veterans Association, holding annual reunions, not just to share memories, but to maintain a brotherhood forged under two fires, enemy artillery and domestic racism. They actively fought for their own legacy, lobbying for the recognition that had been denied them. Most notably the Presidential Unit Citation awarded in 1978 and the long-overdue Medal of Honor for Ruben Rivers. Their efforts extended to ensuring their history was preserved. Corporal Buddy Branch, speaking of the Veterans History Project, affirmed their goal to cement their legacy and memory forever in the Library of Congress. The 761st's most profound legacy was not technical. It was social and doctrinal. Their 183 days of proven, relentless effectiveness provided incontrovertible evidence that directly contradicted the 1925 Army War College report, which had codified the belief that African Americans were inferior and unfit for combat. The performance of the 761st and other segregated units like the Tuskegee Airmen made this doctrine militarily indefensible. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981. It stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." This was not a moral gift, it was a strategic necessity. A decision forced by the battlefield performance of men like Ruben Rivers, Warren Crissy, and Roy King. The 761st had used the tank as an instrument not only of national liberation, but of their own. The story of the 761st transcends the battlefields of World War II. It reveals a universal principle that ideology, whether Nazi racial theory or American segregationist doctrine, shatters against the objective, undeniable reality of performance. Courage, discipline, and sacrifice are not properties of race. They are virtues of character. The Wehrmacht, blinded by propaganda, never understood who was defeating them. The American High Command, blinded by prejudice, almost prevented them from trying. Paul LaRue and Andy Sheridan, who worked to preserve the battalion's oral histories, noted this profound truth, calling the veterans some of the most humble, quiet, unassuming men I've ever been around. They did not fight for glory, they fought to prove they could. This returns us to that cold, muddy field on October 10, 1944. General Patton had issued a pragmatic, almost brutal challenge. What he didn't know was that he was speaking to men who had trained for 2 years not just to kill Krauts, but to kill an ideology. He had asked them to fight for America. They fought, instead, to become America. Patton declared, "I don't care what color you are, come in bu our fine liking." The 761st, by their blood and by their 183-day record, forced the United States military, and eventually the nation itself, to finally mean those words.